Sophia, I think you went through quite a learning process yourself when you wrote the paper. And I'd be very interested to hear what is it that was sort of unexpected for you? What did you actually learn? And if you want to comment on anything you've heard also this morning, please do so.
Great, thank you. Yeah, what did I learn when I was writing the paper? I think, never mind writing the paper, I think I've just learned a huge amount in the last half hour. And from Panos, a lot of what I was hearing from all three of you actually was very much tied to what I learned in the paper. I was hearing from Panos about this idea of collectiveness, which comes out quite strongly. How are we as a collective being relevant? From you, Mary, I was interested to hear you talk about intersectionality and co-design and to come to the crux of these questions about expertise and power. And Maria, I was really struck particularly by, well, everything you said, but one of the things that you said most recently, which was around solidarity. And it put me in mind of one of the papers that was most influential for me when I was writing the background paper, which was Mary Anderson's Time to Listen. And one of the things that she says in it is that what people really needed when you asked them was, amongst other things, solidarity. And it shone a spotlight on, I think, what John was saying, that it's relational as much as it's transactional, and that how we give and how we listen and the humility in that and the solidarity in that is as important, if not more important, than what is provided, so that the how is as important as the what. I think, John, you really clearly summarised what's in the paper, and as I say, the other speakers have pointed to elements of it. So as you say, Johan, rather than summarising what's in the paper, I'll talk a little bit about the learning journey that I went on, very conscious that we're going rather than from the paper to the ground, from the ground to the paper, and I apologise for that. So two things really struck me on my learning journey, and I came to this having not written specifically on the subject of relevance before. Two things struck me. One was how little we've really thought about it face on as a sector, and secondly was how much we'd really have to change if we did. So that first question, how little we've really thought about it, That question that I was given as my essay question, I suppose, is what we're doing relevant to what people really need. It seemed such an obvious question, but when I delved into it, it's one that we rarely properly look into or define well. And of course, we've got the DAC criteria definition that's about whether or not a project is in line with people's or local needs and priorities, and then in brackets, as well as donor priorities. But that's a pretty partial and a pretty fraught definition, and it doesn't really tell us what to do with it. And I dug around and I thought there would be a huge body of literature, because we're pretty good as a sector of generating a lot of literature. I thought there'd be a huge body of literature out there on relevance and how to make sense of relevance, and there just wasn't. I was really surprised by that, and that was one of my key learnings. We do have a very powerful body of work that helps us approach it in different ways. Barbara Harrell-Bond, for one, and that's striking that paper is about 23, 25 years old already, as well as Mary Anderson's Time to Listen, and also that we've approached the question of relevance from different angles and looked at different parts of it very actively. So accountability, participation, inclusion, and we certainly had relevance front of mind back in the 90s, as you were saying, John, when we thought about evolving protection approaches, and more recently, I think cash has been another moment where relevance has come up. But very rarely have we brought it all together and focused all these different searchlights on that one basic question: are we providing what people really need? Are we doing the right things? It's this question that's hiding in plain sight, I think, for all of us. And why is that? I think partly it's because it's big and because it's difficult, and for what is such a fundamentally, quite basically uncontroversial proposition, it's got quite radical implications. And I think the question to us is are we prepared to wrangle with those practical and political and ethical issues? And that comes to the second thing that I learned once I'd got over the shock of discovering that there wasn't a body of literature on relevance to help me write this paper, was how much we would really have to change as a sector if we did take it seriously. And again, reading through, listening to people, I learned how easy it is to let ourselves off the hook on relevance. And I think we let ourselves off the hook in two ways. One is what I call the huge goalpost excuse, which is that everything's relevant. That in the situations in which humanitarian work happens, there's such widespread, such deep, such severe need that if you do anything, it's bound to be relevant in one way or another. That somehow, whatever you do, you'll kind of hit the mark somehow. And I think we can let ourselves off the hook, and certainly we see it happening in evaluations, that it's quite easy to tick a relevance box. It's bound to be relevant to someone somewhere. And then I think the second way that we let ourselves off the hook is by caricaturing both the problem and the answer. And again, you touched on this a little bit, John, that it's very easy to caricature the problem, and the caricature goes something like this, that we're a self-serving, supply-driven, neo-colonial, paternalistic enterprise. And we can caricature the answer by saying, well, we just have to listen more and do what people ask. And both of those things are true in different degrees and in different ways. And if I'm very honest with you, that's kind of what the first draft of the paper looked like. You nearly had a 9-word paper that said, get over yourselves, listen more, act on it. And I apologize that you didn't get a 9-word background paper. But what I did learn is that we let ourselves off the hook if we leave it at that and don't scratch around and get to the bottom of all of these, and that we're not being honest with ourselves about committing to engaging with the challenges. And what's come out very clearly from the other three speakers is that we need to grapple with what happens when these nice concepts and these purist ideas hit the ground, when concepts hit these messy, complex realities of politics and of personal realities, diverse personal realities. And the implications of those are far-reaching. They're far-reaching, as you said, for culture, for power dynamics, for our structures, and for the political economies that we work in. And they bring with them a lot of dilemmas for us, dilemmas of expertise, of the who knows best, which is very much played out in the medical profession. Dilemmas of action, what to do, how to do it, and dilemmas of boundaries, of when to let go, when we should start to become irrelevant and let other people take over. And that's very much why I landed on calling the paper More Relevant, because there's no static, universal, perfect answer. You're never going to score 100% on the relevance test. There's going to be compromises along the way. But what I did learn, and I like the way that you phrased it very much as a journey for ICRC, that what we do need to be prepared to do is put the question of relevance up front in everything we do. That needs to be our touchstone and our benchmark, and we need to be prepared to answer it with honesty and with integrity rather than just ticking a box. I suppose in summary, what I learned how to ask a lot of questions. I think there's probably a prize, isn't there, for how many question marks there are in the background paper, and that's very much the privilege of writing one of these things. What I'm looking forward to over the next 2 days is learning from the immense expertise and the honesty and experience and integrity in this room of how to answer some of them.
Thank you, Sophia. I think that's a very wise approach. We are not sort of looking ahead towards a paradigm shift, but with greater understanding and insight, we can actually gradually change the approaches that we take. Can I ask you a follow-up question? Because you referred to your own paper that you wrote recently on the consequences of underfunded and the risks, the increasing resource constraints in the whole humanitarian sector. To what extent does that impact and sort of prevent people from doing what they may realize should be done, the absence or the lack of resources to actually do what they understand is right?
It's a really good question. I think lack of resources hits on everything. I'm not sure whether it's more important than lack of access. And one of the things that struck me yesterday, I was lucky enough to sit in on the skills building day. So the day before the annual meeting, as many of you were there, many of you know ALNAP brings together evaluation practitioners, and we were grappling with, and I was listening to experts grappling with this question of how do we monitor in an ongoing way? How do we bring in a depth of anthropological understanding and as you were saying, Mary, some of these questions about power and about the social realities on the ground, how do we bring those in rather than just flying somebody in for a week to do an evaluation at the end of a report? And one of the things that came up was it's really costly. It's really costly to have somebody on the ground for 3 months, understanding the situation. It's costly to monitor the whole time. But what I heard was quite a bit of pushback to that, actually, that there's ways and means, particularly, and I think this is where we hit up against localization and some of the questions of letting go, that it doesn't need to be more expensive than what we're doing. It just demands a different way of doing things. So I think certainly resources are a problem, but let's not put it into the category of things that are insurmountable barriers to asking the right questions and doing the right things.